and welcome to ARTFul Insights. I'm Shane Farrell, the Digital Projects and Programs Manager for ARTZ Philadelphia, and together you and I are going to look at some art today. This video is produced in partnership between Dementia Society of America and ARTZ Philadelphia. Each month we offer a live program where a small group of people talk about a work of art or works of art from museums and cultural centers around the country. It's a different museum or cultural center each month, and in addition to that live program, we also produce a video like the one you're watching right now. We look at the same works of art as we did in the live group, but with the video it's 30 to 40 minutes in length. You can watch it anytime, day or night, that might suit you. And it's an opportunity to have a more intimate, self-driven conversation about the art. I'll ask a few questions to get us started, give you a few things to think about. I'll share some of the observations and thoughts that folks from the live group brought up that I think might be interesting for you to consider. But really, this video each month is about you. It's about what you see in these works of art, how you respond to them, and just having the opportunity to look at a work of art and think about it at your own pace. If you're watching this video with someone, please feel free to pause from time to time if you'd like, so that you can have your own conversation. If you're watching on your own, we're delighted to have you, and it'll be a conversation just between the two of us. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the museum or cultural center that we're visiting today. Welcome to ARTFul Insights. So, here we are at the museum that we're going to be visiting today. This is the American Visionary Art Museum. It's located in Baltimore, Maryland. So if you're in Philadelphia, it's not too far away. The American Visionary Art Museum is a repository for intuitive and self-taught artistry. So what does that mean exactly? Visionary art is defined for the purposes of the American Visionary Art Museum as referring to art produced by self-taught individuals, usually without formal training, whose works arise from an innate personal vision that revels foremost in the creative act itself. So, in short, visionary art begins by listening to the inner voices of the soul and often may not even be thought of as art by its creator. So, in short, it's art that comes from within, comes from a very personal vision. It may be made by someone who is not formally trained, never went to art school, maybe someone who lies outside of what we would typically consider as an artist. Sometimes people call this kind of work outsider art. But basically, it's people who are just driven to make things, who want to explore something personal to them. The museum began in 1984 as an idea by its founder, Rebecca Alban Hofberger, and she wanted to found a museum that focused on intuitive, creative invention, development of a kind of grassroots form of art making. And this idea developed while she was working for a program that was a part of the Department of Psychiatry at Sinai Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. So, over the next decade or so, the museum went through seeking funding, working on developing a collection, staff, etc., and finally opened publicly in 1995. So now that we've learned a little bit about the museum, why don't we go ahead and take a look at the artwork that we're going to be viewing today. So here we are having a look at today's artwork. And before I say anything about it, I just want you to take a moment to look it over, see whatever you see, notice whatever you notice, and let your eye take you wherever it wants you to go. This might be a little different than what you're used to. Typically, we're looking at paintings. Today, we're looking at something that seems to be a three-dimensional object. So maybe as you look, think about that. Think about walking around this object and viewing it from all sides and what that might be like. So I'm going to give you a minute to look this over, and then we'll come back and have a bit of a discussion about it. So, when you had a chance to look this over, was there anything that first caught your eye about this? Was there something that jumped out at you as unique or interesting about this artwork? I would love to hear what the first things you noticed were. One of the first things I'd like to ask about this artwork is just what you notice about the overall shape of it. What do we think this shape is supposed to represent? If it's supposed to represent anything at all. Maybe it's a non-representational shape. It's just a shape being a shape. But what does this shape remind you of? What do you think it might be? Well, most of our participants in our group online discussion seem to think that this was an egg. And it does kind of look like an egg, doesn't it? The way it's a bit wider at the bottom, gets a little smaller on top. It's kind of a big oval shape. One of our participants said, "It's a shimmering egg of all colors. It's really very pretty." Do you agree with that? Do you think this is a very pretty artwork? Does it look like it's shimmering to you? And maybe we can come back to that question a little bit later about shimmering and why this object might look like it's shimmering. Another participant said it reminded them of Ukrainian hand-painted Easter eggs, but on steroids. Have you ever painted Easter eggs by hand? Does this remind you of that at all? Or does it make you think of something else entirely? If you imagine this as a giant Easter egg, what would you paint on your giant sculptural Easter egg? What do you think you would want to represent? Or what kind of colors would you use? What kind of shapes would you employ? And while we're talking about colors, why don't we take a look at the colors of this piece? And in fact, why don't we zoom in a little bit so we can get a bit of a closer look? So let's start at the top here. Are there any colors you notice in particular at the top of this artwork? Is there something that stands out to you? there's a lot to look at. It's a very busy sort of artwork, right? There's a lot of different things going on. So it might be hard to focus on one particular thing. But something that jumped out at me a little bit was right over here, where I'm moving my mouse. So there's kind of a golden yellow area. If you look even closer, there's some reddish parts to it. If we look over here, we might notice some purples, blues, turquoise colors, different cool shades. And if we look down here at this shape here, we might notice some reddish colors, some brownish colors, some maroons, some kind of clay colors. There's all sorts of colors within the surface of this piece, both on the bottom down here and up here at the top. So let's zoom out again for a second now that we've looked closely at some of the colors, and let's just kind of look at the colors overall. So when we zoom out, do you notice anything different about the colors? Do you notice any overall patterns of what might be going on here? Something that I notice when I'm looking at the colors overall is that it's kind of broken down into different sections. So if we look at this section here, it's kind of top corner, we see a lot of blue. There's other things going on as well, but I see a lot of blue. When I look at this kind of middle section, cutting across the center here, I see a lot of white and silver kind of colors. And when I look at the bottom down here, in this corner, notice kind of darker gray colors. So when we look at these overall patterns of color, is there something it reminds us of? Is there something it evokes? Is there a reason we think the top is all bluish, the bottom grayish, and the middle kind of silver? Well, one participant said, "To me it looks like all the colors of a peacock. So maybe one big peacock laid it. Blues and yellows and pinks and all those gorgeous colors." I think that's a really fun idea, that a peacock's egg might be just as colorful as the peacock itself. What do you think if an animal had laid this egg? What kind of animal do you think it would be? Well, another participant fixed on the same sort of separation of colors that I just talked about. He said the top half seems to have this overall influence of medium blue, bottom half seems more white, and then there's a dark gray toward the right. And he said, is it a shadow being reflected into the egg, or is it something that's actually on the surface? He had the same question about the blue. He said, maybe is that the sky being reflected in the material of the egg? Or is the material the egg is made out of actually blue? What do you think? And remember, there's no wrong answers to any of these questions. You're allowed to interpret this however you want. Of course, there is a certain material that this is made out of, but every way you see it is legitimate. Well, what conclusion did you come to? What material did you think that this egg might be made of? A lot of our participants seemed to think it was little pieces of mosaic tile. and maybe pieces of mirror and colored glass. So that's interesting. So maybe this egg is made out of little pieces of mirror cut up and placed all over the surface of the egg. So that would explain why at the top we see blue, because maybe that's just the blue sky in Baltimore being reflected in a mirror. And down here, this kind of silvery white part, maybe that's just the reflection of the sidewalk, the ground, which we'll notice looking around is kind of whitish and grayish as well. And then the darker part here, we notice there's maybe a shadow being cast by the egg that goes off to the right. So perhaps that's a reflection of that shadow, or just that part of the egg is kind of in darkness. So now that we've talked a little bit about what we think the surface of this piece might be made out of, what do we think the surface of this piece might represent? What do we see when we look at it? So let's just zoom in on it one more time and kind of take a slow glance from top to bottom. So here we are at the top. I'm noticing a lot of circular shapes. So I notice circular reddish shape over here, circular goldish shape over here, a bunch of circular bluish shapes kind of combined in a blob. Is there other shapes here that are catching your eye? And besides the different colored shapes, what do we notice about the way the tiles, the mirrored tiles, if we agree they're mirrors, are moving through this piece? So if you were to, take your hand on the edge of this piece and kind of trace how the tiles are moving. Usually museums don't like it when you touch the art, but we can pretend. If you were to take your hand and kind of trace the way these tiles are moving, how would you describe the way that they move? Kind of move my mouse around on some of these tiles. How would you describe this movement that you're seeing? To me, it kind of feels like a swirling motion. Would you agree with that? Do you think it's something different? Maybe it could feel something like a flowing river, flowing water, something that's flowing through a space. But there's lots of kind of curvature, and it moves us through it in an interesting kind of way. Does that evoke anything specific for you? How would you describe the sense of movement in this artwork? Or does it not feel like it's moving very much at all to you? Does it feel very still? To me, it feels like it's moving. Maybe to you, it feels like it's just standing still. And we can both be right. Well, as we move down the egg, there's a very prominent shape here that's kind of hard to ignore. There's this circle in the middle, and then it kind of has these two tails coming out of it. What do you think this shape might be? What do you think? What kind of shape is that? I'm not entirely sure yet what I think it is, but I'd love to hear what you think it is. And then over here, if we look really closely over here, Let me see if I can zoom in just a little bit further. If we look really closely over here, there seems to be a circle with a bunch of triangles sticking out of it. What do we think that shape might be? So we've got these lines throughout that are kind of swirling around. We've got some circular shapes. We've got this big shape at the bottom with these two tails coming out of it. We've got this shape off to the side where there's a circle with a bunch of triangles coming out of it. What do we think this pattern is? Is the artist trying to represent something specific, or is it just abstract? Well, one of our participants in our online group discussion said, I see it as planets and creation on the outside of the egg. And that's reflecting the same creation that's going on inside the egg, where cells are forming life. So that's a really interesting way to look at this, I think. So on the outside, we have all these planets. We have, our solar system or beyond, the universe at large, if you want. And inside, because it's an egg, we have something that's being born. So there's creation in this very large sense, and there's creation in this smaller sense. Creation at the scale of the universe, outer space, and creation at the scale of just an animal that's being born. Does that resonate with you at all? Another person said, I see two eyes and a drip of hair at the right. So I think when they said two eyes, they were referring to this circle here and this circle here. And the drip of hair, I think they were referring to this line right here. So maybe this isn't an egg at all. Maybe it's a big face. It's really interesting how we can all look at the same object and come up with so many different ways to look at it. Is there something that you saw that's different than both of these? Well, as we continue to talk about eggs and life and outer space in our group online discussion, someone said, I want to let this egg morph into anything it wanted to. Otherwise, it would be very restricted. And that's kind of what we're doing here today, right? With our imagination as we look at this. The egg can really morph into anything we want it to. I keep calling it the egg, but if you don't think it's an egg, that's fine. It's just my shorthand for this sculpture. As I mentioned, one person saw a face, another person saw galaxies on an egg. Maybe you see something else entirely. So the egg can morph into anything we want it to morph into. This person then talked about how they felt like our society has come a long way, but at the same time, we're dealing with some of the same problems we have been for hundreds of years. And that's why they wanted the egg to keep morphing and changing, because it needed to continue to change to allow the world to change. This is the same person who saw the kind of space scene on the outside of the egg. So to them, the egg represented new beginnings. It represented the possibility of change. Does it represent anything like that to you, or anything completely different than that. What do we think this artwork means? What does it mean to us? We don't have to think about what the artist was thinking about. We can just talk about what it might mean to us. Well, one of our participants in the online group discussion said, "It makes me think about all the creative people that are going to be inside the museum. It's the perfect way to enter this creative space. All the ideas that are germinating inside the egg are also germinating inside each artist, each creative person that goes into the museum." I think that's a really great way to look at it. We're kind of doing the same thing today, right? We're being creative. We're coming up with ideas, and we're letting this sculpture guide us in that process. So I would hope you agree with this person, because I hope when we look at this together, we are entering a creative space the same way that people visiting this artwork are entering a museum. You and I, even though we're just on our computers, are entering a creative place as well, together with each other through this conversation. Now I want to just pull back for a second and ask a very simple, straightforward question. We talked a lot about what do we think this means? What does it represent? We talked about outer space and the creation of life inside of eggs and going into museums and creative spaces. But now let's just think about something really simple. How big do we think this egg is? One of our participants said, "It's very large, isn't it?" Do you agree with that? Do you think this is a very large sculpture? Or do you think this might be very small? And what kind of context clues are you using to help you decide that? Maybe you're thinking about the size of the individual tiles on the egg and how many of those might equal a certain size. Or maybe you're just kind of getting an intuitive sense of it. Maybe you're looking at the brick wall in the background and trying to decide, okay, it looks like it's this far away from the brick wall, and it comes up to this high on the brick wall, so that must mean it's this big. If you had to put a number on it, what height would you say this is? And while we're thinking about the physical properties of this egg, what do you think it might be made out of? We talked a little bit about the tiles, right? And how they might be mosaic tiles, they might be glass, they might be pieces of mirror. But also, how do we think the structure of this is built? And what materials do we think would help this egg live in this kind of environment? As one of our participants in our online group discussion pointed out, they said, if the egg is outside 24/7, 365 days a year, maybe there's some sort of mesh that allows the egg to breathe. And it's outside in all kinds of temperatures. So maybe it needs to breathe somehow, otherwise it would get really hot on the inside. Another participant said, "This reminds me that I had a job where I worked with polystyrene, making jet skis and snowmobiles. And it seems like the perfect kind of material to allow the egg to survive outside and do what it needs to do. You could make a mold and decorate it however you want. I don't know how familiar with polystyrene you are. I'm not super familiar with it, but I've seen jet skis and snowmobiles, and I know the kind of molded plastic material this person's referring to. So maybe there's kind of a molded plastic here that's being covered in little tiles. And according to this participant, it'd be a perfect material for keeping something outside all day. Is there any material you think this might be? Maybe you've worked with mosaic before and you have an idea of how you might build this. Well, we've really went on kind of a journey with this sculpture here, from talking about simple things like materials and color to almost philosophical ideas about what this artwork might mean. And sometimes a way we like to summarize all of the things that we notice in a work of art that we're looking at is by giving it a title. So if you had to give this artwork a title as a way of kind of wrapping up all the ideas that we've talked about together, what would you title this artwork? I'd love to hear what title you came up with. Some of the participants in our online group discussion came up with their own titles. One participant said, I would call it Swirling Egg. And we did talk about it looks like a giant egg. There are all these lines that are swirling around it. So maybe Swirling Egg would be the title. Another participant came up with a more jokey sort of title. They called it Breakfast in Baltimore. So maybe we're just going to crack this giant egg open and eat it for breakfast. I'm sure you came up with titles that were just as interesting and fun as these titles. But now, why don't I just give some final details about the artwork as we wrap up here today. Well, this artwork is by an artist named Andrew Logan. It's called Cosmic Egg. So maybe the participant who I mentioned who was talking about planets and outer space was onto something there that the artist was also interested in. It's about 8 feet tall. So I'm curious what number you came up with. And this version of it, there's kind of multiple versions of similar sculptures by this artist. But this version was completed in 2004. Supposedly, the artist was inspired, at least in part, by photos they saw captured by the Hubble telescope. So photos of outer space. Have you ever seen a photograph like that, and did it feel inspiring to you as well? Well, why don't we end on that note about thinking about things that might inspire us and make us think of things larger than ourselves. I want to thank you so much for joining me today and having a conversation with me about this artwork. I really enjoyed spending this time with you, and I hope you enjoyed spending this time with me. I want to give a big thanks to the American Visionary Art Museum for having us and for letting us look at artworks from their collection. I want to thank specifically Mavette Rosas, who helped put this program together. Big thanks to her. It would not have been possible without her assistance. And I just want to encourage you to either take a look at other Artful Insights videos, or perhaps join us sometime for one of our group discussions online. You can find out all about our upcoming programs at ARTZphilly, that's arts with a Z, .org. And there's an events calendar on there that will tell you about upcoming Artful Insights programs and all the other programs that we have. So if you enjoyed looking at this with me today, you might enjoy looking at something like this with a group of people. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed your time. I'm Shane Farrell, the Digital Projects and Programs Manager for Arts Philadelphia, and I want to thank you once again for joining us for Artful Insights.